Okay, so welcome to the Live from the Sword Coast podcast. My name is Kevin Madison, and I will actually be your friendly reviewer for the evening. Normally, I use this channel to host actual play sessions for a bunch of different games. Recently, I had an opportunity to run 7th Sea, the second edition game published by John Wick Presents, and I had one of the viewers, Nefarious Cole, and forgive me if I'm butchering that name, suggests I post a review after playing the game, or running the game, I should say, because I should preface this by saying that my background with 7th Sea is that I actually bought the first, I remember buying the first edition of 7th Sea when it first came out. I was at the time working at a resort in the Canadian Rockies, so I had no access to a gaming store and whatnot. I was on a break or a vacation visiting home, and the friendly local gaming store that I usually went to had got 7th Sea in, but they weren't allowed to put it on the shelves for another day or so. And the store owner, I explained the circumstances that I was only in town for a couple of days and I wasn't going to be able to be there for it. He actually cracked the boxes and sold me one under the promise I wouldn't tell anyone that I got a copy early. So that's how excited I was to get the original 7th Sea. I had played and run Legend of the Five Rings previously, which is another one of the John Wick produced games, or he was at least involved with that. I'm not too sure what his specific role was in that game. But in any event, so first edition 7th Sea, I owned all the Nation books for it, most of the Secret Society books for it. I really enjoyed that game a lot, except for when it actually came to run it. It was a really unfortunate case where the mechanics didn't really match up with what you were actually running. So when I heard that there's a second edition of 7th Sea coming out, I was really excited about it. In particular, given the change in mechanics, they were going to go with a new kind of mechanics in this. I'm going to talk about the mechanics afterwards because I think that after running one session of it, and we recorded the session as well too, so you're free to check out that session. I don't think that I was really at my best as a DM for that session, just because I was struggling a lot with trying to figure out how the system actually is supposed to be run. And after reading the book again afterwards and thinking about it, I think the problem is just that this is just not the game for me. The game as written, the mechanics of it are what I feel is the biggest shortcoming of the game. But I'm going to save that for the end. That's sort of the negative stuff. So I want to start with the positives first. So 7th Sea is a game that is about, if you're not familiar with it, is about really like the golden age of piracy, or the sort of political intrigue that comes from like the 15th to 17th century. I think that's sort of the golden age of piracy period. If you can think of the Three Musketeers, or you think of Count of Monte Cristo, or really kind of like any of the Disney Pirates movies, that's all stuff that sort of fits up in 7th Sea. It's 7th Sea is set in a fictional version of Europe that is called Thea. And I can actually show you, they've got a pretty nifty looking map. It's a little bit too modern looking. I would have liked to see more of a artistic version of the map. Let me see if I can get that. There we go. But it's a functional, great map. The sort of cognates of European nations there's a British Isles trio of kingdoms, or of individual kingdoms or nations. There's a French analog called Montaigne. There's a Germany analog called Eisen. There's a Spanish analog called Castile. There's an Italian analog called Vodacce. And actually, I don't know if I may be pronouncing these wrong as well, but Vodacce or Vodassa. There is a Russian analog called Usura. There's a sort of, it's really thematically or culturally, it feels like a Danish or at least a Scandinavian country called Vestinmanavinjar. But I feel like it's got some elements of the Netherlands in it as well too, with the trading companies and stuff like that. And then finally, a new addition in this game, which wasn't in the original game, is something called the Sarmatian Commonwealth, which is kind of like a democratic Polish kind of setting, or I think it's either Polish or Ukrainian. In any event, Slavic, but not Usuran. One big improvement in this version over the first version is that the world is a lot bigger in this. So there is a new world. There's an Africa analog. There's a sort of Far East analog. There's a Middle Eastern analog called the Crescent Empire. In the earlier edition, one of the shortcomings is that they set up this great, the age of sail and the age of travel and stuff like, or not travel, of global trade becoming a burgeoning thing. But there's nowhere to go in the actual game. Like, they sort of missed the point of why there was a golden age of piracy. The golden age of piracy really kind of kicked off because of Spanish silver coming in from the New World. That became a popular target because there was such an incredible amount of wealth coming into Europe from that. In the original version, there was no new world, so it's not really clear where everyone was sailing to. In this, they do a much better job of that. So it's a much more comprehensive setting, or at least a more sophisticated setting where they're embracing a lot of the non-European cultures. The setting material in the book is about 121 pages. It's got some terrific stuff in there. It's not a comprehensive overview of each of the nations, but they give you enough to sort of springboard from. The earlier game, the first edition, was released in the 90s, and like a lot of games in the 90s, it suffered from a just crippling amount of meta plot. So there was a meta plot that was moving forward, and nothing ever came out, but I got the feeling that there was a sense that they were going to release like a card game or some similar type of thing to link in with 7th Sea, as they did with, Five Rings. The card game came first, and then the role-playing game came on afterwards. But that sort of meta plot driving sales forward on games was very popular in a lot of different companies at that time. They don't have that in this, so their maybe excuse for why you don't have a huge amount of information about each of the different nations is because they don't want to saddle the DM with a preset stories. They give you great story threads in some of the supplemental books, like the Nations of Thea books that have come out since the core book came out for 2nd edition. But this one does give you enough, though, to get a sense of what each place is like, and it gives you some terrific art as well, too. Like, the art in this book is just amazing, really evocative. Tons of great pictures that could be repurposed for NPCs or PCs, and lots of stuff that really gets you into the mindset of what each nation or each culture, I guess, is like. In terms of the making characters, I feel like it borrows one of the ideas that I really love from the Iron Kingdoms role-playing game, which is to make a character, you pick a nation, you pick 2 backgrounds, which are really evocative kind of professional descriptions. So you could make like a pirate or a ship captain who is also a former musketeer, or you could make a let me take a look at the actual sheets here. You can make an army officer who was also a duelist, and so on. There's a ton of different basic backgrounds, and then there are backgrounds that are specific to each nation. And then each of the supplemental books that have been coming out, they've been adding new things too. So there's tons of really neat stuff to mix and match back and forth. You then get some points to sort of specialize your character, and you also pick a hubris and a virtue. So it's sort of like you pick them from a Thean version of sort of tarot, and it informs how your character is going to get a resource back called hero points that you use to spend. If you're familiar with games like, it's advantage in, or not advantage, it's inspiration in 5th edition D&D, but like action points in earlier versions of D&D or in D20 Modern, or hero points in DC Adventures, or feat points in Iron Kingdoms, force points in Star Wars role-playing games. It's points you get to do some neat stuff with, and there's some mechanical tricks you can do, and there's some narrative stuff you can do. It's the way that you mitigate what's otherwise just the vagaries of dice rolls. So that's pretty cool. Like, you do get a good sense when you've created your character of who this person is, what kind of motivates them, what their weaknesses are in terms of personality shortcomings. And that's where your hubris comes in. You pick your hubris. One of the things I'm not crazy about in the game, and I think it's just because the way that I DM, is that your hubris, you can trigger your hubris in a certain circumstance. And an example is one of the players in the session that we played was, his hubris was something to the effect of he couldn't let things go. Like if there was, he held grudges, and anytime he brought that up and it caused problems for him, he'd get a hero point. But as a DM, you can actually trigger them for the player. You can say, oh, you've got to do this turn. And I was talking with my players afterwards, and one of the things I don't like about that is I never really liked stripping players of their agency, at least in terms of how they're playing their characters. I'll strip them in terms of their agency of what they can and cannot do, because I got control over everything else in the world. But and there are games like the hero system or GURPS or some other systems that have disadvantages where you will randomly trigger them. So like if your character is an alcoholic, you have to make a roll to see if that disadvantage is triggered when you're in a situation where you can get access to alcohol, or you have bad temper, so you have to make a roll. And I like that mechanic a lot more than me being able to trigger it as a DM, because since it's the same reward anyway, when the DM triggers it, it is a hero point for the player, and the player gets the same thing too. I mean, you can sort of suggest as a DM, but I mean, if the player says no, I don't want to trigger it, I'm not crazy about the fact that you can force them to trigger it. So that's just a small part. Otherwise, I really do like the character generation system. It's a lot of fun to make characters. Before I ran the game, before I actually had the players play through it, I really had high hopes for this game. It sounded really cool. I'd watched some actual play videos of it as well to make sure I understood the system, or at least to see how other people were using the system. And it's a great setting. It's a really, really cool setting. It also incorporates kind of a dark, low fantasy aspect as well. There are different types of sorcery that players can learn that are specific to each nation. So like in Montaigne, which is the French analog, you can learn this, or you can be a character who has access to this power called Porta. And Porta is basically the ability to rip bleeding holes in reality that are portals to somewhere else. So, you can rip them open and then bring something from somewhere else. There are limitations to that are in the rules, but that's the kind of, really a very cool, very evocative and different sorcery that you can have access to. Each of the nations has its own kind of sorcery too. Avalon, like the equivalent of the British Isles, has glamour and has a very kind of Arthurian fairy kind of feel to it. There is a type of magic called Hexworken, which comes from Eisen, which is the German analog, which is a really neat kind of like cobbling together things. It's sort of like folk tales or like folk beliefs that have actual mechanical power to them, or magical power to them, like digging up the bones of a robber and then making something from it. The Sarmatian Commonwealth has a really cool type of magic where you can your character makes deals with these things called dievas, and once you make 7 deals with these dievas, they sort of are these not interdimensional, but I guess like spiritual sort of creatures that are lurking around waiting to make deals with you. And when you've made your 7th deal with them, they then get to take something of significant meaning from you, and you get and they get to manifest in the real world. So I guess tell as I'm getting excited talking about this, like the setting itself and a lot of the materials in here are really, really cool. It really just sets your brain going. It's really easy to come up with neat ideas for characters. One of the things that I really love about character creation as well, and their advancement system, is that rather than getting sort of blank experience points, what you get is for each step you take towards a new story, you will get a point. And if it's a DM story, then you'll just get points and you'll be able to spend them accordingly. But each player also makes their own story. So they make the first step in their story and they say what it is. So it could be like you have amnesia, or it could be that you've got a missing family member, or you want vengeance on someone, or you're seeking for the return of some family property. And then at the end, you'll set how many steps that'll be. And then at the end of that, you will get a new advantage that's based on the number, same cost as the number of steps in it. So I really like that because it gives players some agency over the direction of the story as well. So I really, really love that stuff. Now, unfortunately, so the enthusiasm for that sort of dimmed when I actually ran it. So the way that the mechanics work in this is pretty simple. It uses D10s, and it uses a dice pool mechanic. Your dice pool is built off of your attribute and one of your skills. And the skills are a very simple list. Your character sheet, maybe I can hold that up so you can see what I mean here. The character sheet is very simple. There's very few things to keep track of. But you do, because of the narrative aspect of the game, you do come up with a really fully fleshed character with some great backstory. One of the ways when I used to run Iron Kingdoms was because in that game, for those not familiar with it, you also pick two different careers. And then the way we were sort of running it was that one of the careers is the career that the character was doing at the time the campaign started, and one of them is their background career. It's something they used to do. So you could have combinations, like we had a guy who was playing a gunslinger priest, a guy who he was sort of like a Pale Rider type character. He used to be a merciless gunslinger, and then finally found faith, had a crisis of conscience, joined the priesthood, and that's where he was starting. And I sort of had been thinking that this would be a cool way to use this as well too, to give you some great baked-in backstory for your characters. Each of the backgrounds you pick, incidentally, also gives you a quirk, which is a little thing that if you do this once per session, you can gain a hero point back. And they're, again, also really, really story evocative. The ship's captain, if in a scene they make sure everyone else is on their cruise to safety before they do, they get a point back. The privateer is an Avalon-based career or background. That one, if you thwart the foes of Avalon, because you're a privateer, you're actually sailing on a letter of marque, being a pirate basically for the state. Oh, my dog found her toy. Then every time you do that, you get a hero point back, or once per session. So again, like really, really cool stuff to make some really interesting characters. But the way the mechanics work is you build your dice pool between the skills and the attributes. And then what you're doing is basically, let me back up. What the DM will do is describe a scene, and then you will describe what your approach is going to be on that scene. And the way that it's sort of described in the game is basically like, very, very broad. It's supposed to be in very broad categories. And then it encourages you to mix it up, because between each, oh honey, sorry, my dog's found, she knows I'm recording, so she's got her toy. The way that it encourages you to shake things up is by giving you an incentive, extra dice, if you try something different afterwards. So you do one thing one round, and then another thing another round. So you describe the scene, then you build your dice pool, you roll those dice, and then you try to match up tens. So if you rolled, for instance, like a 4, a 5, a 7, a 9, and a 1, you'd maybe put the 9 and the 1 together. You'd put the 4 and the 4, the 5, and the 3 together to get. So you'd have a total of, I guess, 2 raises. Then they call them raises in the game. That's another thing I find out. There seems to be a fetish with some game designers to really make their descriptions of the terms in their game differ from other games, and I understand the appeal of that, because it's trying to be evocative of the setting and whatever else, but it gets really fucking irritating when you're trying to describe a new game to new players who just don't hear it that way. Like, for instance, in Shadowrun 5th edition, they call successes hits. And I cannot tell you how it was effectively like an Abbott and Costello routine the first time we ran combat in that system, because everyone's saying, oh, I got this many hits. So you hit? No, I didn't actually hit, because he rolled more dodges. So my hits weren't enough to, you can picture that. So anyway, in this game, raises are what you're looking for. That's when you build your tens. Leftover dice can be purchased by the DM for what goes into what's called their Doom Pool. The Doom Pool is sort of like the DM's pool of resources that they use to modify villains and so forth. And also make things, to ratchet up the difficulty for players. So the once you've got your points, everyone rolls those dice pool, or their dice pools, and the DM will roll the dice pool for any villains. Now, there's a difference in the game between villains, capital V, and brute squads. Brutes are sort of like this game's version of minions. Minions are effectively a passive actor because they don't do anything in a round until the end of it. Effectively, what they're there to do is it's a countdown for damage that you're automatically going to take unless you mitigate them or kill them all. But I'll get back to that in a moment. So what you'll do is you'll count the number of raises you got, and then starting with the person with the highest raises, you'll go down, and each person will be able to take an action. And normally your action will cost you 1 raise, and then you can spend extra raises to make it either better or to, like for instance, raises are what you use to do damage. There's no damage dice or anything like that in this game. If you are a duelist, or if you have certain advantages, or if you use a firearm, those things will modify how much damage you do, but otherwise it's 1 point of damage for each raise you spend. Raises can also be used to do, it's really to any action in a scene that is like contested, like racing across a room, or dodging falling timbers in a burning house. You also have in each scene there will be consequences, which are negative things that will happen. It's effectively the way you get injured by anything other than a villain, and you can deal with those by spending raises. You just narrate how you do that. And you have opportunities, and opportunities are just the way they describe it in the game is like running through a burning building. Avoiding the falling timbers would be a consequence that you're going to spend raises to avoid. Grabbing a note in there before the house burns down would be an opportunity. And then raises could maybe be spent to like, I don't know, like knock down an enemy who's in there, one of the members of the brute squad. That's really it. Like that's the extent of the mechanics in the system. So the way the game, I guess, is supposed to play out, or the way I've seen it played, is everyone's supposed to really fill in lots and lots of narrative meat to sort of make up for the fact that there's really not much more game there. And when I say game there, I just mean the mechanics of the game. There's not really any more mechanical complexity to the game than just that. So one of the complicating factors as well is if you choose to do something different than the approach you chose, you have there's a tithe that's paid on you. You pay 1 extra raise on it. You can also spend raises to make things more difficult for other players, like other characters. So effectively, what ends up happening is everyone picks their approach, they roll that, but unless you're doing that same thing throughout all of those actions, you're going to suffer a penalty. And it seems like for starting characters, you're never really rolling unless you're blowing hero points to gain extra dice. And when you do spend hero points, then these dice, it's a carryover from an earlier edition, your dice explode. And if you're familiar with Savage Worlds, you know how that works. You roll a 10, you get to roll it again, and it counts again. And if it rolls a 10 again, you carry on. In a game where you're trying to match groups of 10 with your dice, that's great because you get tons and tons of raises. The most raises we saw rolled in our session, I believe, was 16. When the character who was ultimately optimized to do this thing, he was the ship captain, was doing some stuff, and he blew a hero point and rolled really well, rolled a ton of raises. But that's the most we saw. On average, it was between about 2 and maybe 4 or 5, depending on how competent the character was. So that means you only get about between 2 and 5 raises for each action to sort of describe what you're doing. If you have 2, it's pretty easy because you're only going to have a couple of opportunities to do the approach you chose. If you chose athletics, you're only going to do that once or twice and then wait for the next round. If you chose something more complex, and you rolled 5 raises, you have a lot of opportunities for actions. But if you choose to do something different, like we had, if you rolled weaponry, say, and you rolled 5 successes on that, but then the villain uses their actions to try and run away, and now you want to use your raises to do that, the rules suggest that that's going to cost you 2. Now, I could be getting that wrong, but the amount of description for the system in this is about 4 pages. So while the DM section is really great in terms of advice for designing stories and capturing the theme and the kinds of stories you can tell with this, it's not really great for giving any further direction as to how you actually, as a DM, use this in play. There are no subsystems. It's as if they designed just a very baseline dice mechanic and then went no further with it. Now, if you're the type of DM who likes to improvise stuff or to kludge together systems on your own, which I actually ended up having to do in our ship-to-ship encounter, but I'll talk about that in a moment. It can be really good. It can be a lot of fun. But for a game that's in its second edition of development, and B, had this much of a Kickstarter backing, I would have expected to see a lot more suggestions for subsystems in this. I mean, similar narrative games, I think, like Blaze in the Dark or like Masks, they give a lot better advice on how these mechanics should play out at your table. So what it ends up, and I guess the other problem is that you can use your raises to counter what other people are doing. So if someone attacks you and they do 1 point of, spend a raise to do a point of damage to you, you can spend a raise to negate that. And that seems to be exactly how you can, that cuts across the line. Now there are certain modifiers. So like, it's not going to be like, Flintstones boxing where it's just like boom, 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 in all circumstances, because things like your advantages or duelist schools or duelist maneuvers can really boost certain aspects. So like a duelist in our session, we had a duelist fighting a guy who didn't have any duelist training. And the duelist was doing just a ton more damage. He could spend 1 raise and do 5 points of damage. And each hero has on average about 20 hits, and then they're down. So you do 5 on a hit. Whereas with the other player had to blow the non-duelist had to blow a hero point in order to do comparable damage. With his, he had an ability that a lot of them use his crossbow to do. He was an expert kind of, crossbow archer. So, I mean, there are different character things that'll change that. But if you're having characters who are at parity, so you've got a duelist against a duelist, it's really going to feel a lot like Flintstones boxing, where it's just like, I'll spend my thing to do this and I'll counter that, and I'll spend it to do this and I'll counter that. When there's a strictly contested, action, which comes up a lot in role-playing games, what we really sort of came to at the end is really like what the system, again, it's just the system, and I understand there's you're supposed to narrate out stuff more, but really what it boils down to is flowery description that goes around whoever rolls the highest amount of raises, they get to do what they want to do because the other person can counter them. So I don't know. I mean, I may be missing if anyone who views this has further insight as to what their experience has been like with the 7th C second edition system. I'd love to hear it because I really wanted to love this game a lot more than what I did. But anyway, so that's the system. Here's another specific shortcoming that I found in the game too is there's no chase rules in this. And in particular, a race related to that, there's not any clear indication of how ship combat is supposed to function. This is a game about sailing on the 7 seas and piracy and whatever. And there's really not a lot of great guidance. They give you rules for how much damage a ship takes. They give some really cool rules on how each ship from different nation differs. You can also get backgrounds for your ships, which is really neat, and you can get stories. You can get further advantages, little features for your ship by completing certain things, kind of like achievements in video games. So if you say have sailed to all of the nations of Thea, you get an ability that called a Jenny in every port. And what that allows you to do is when you show up in port, by default, the quartermaster is going to be neutral to you at worst. So that's really cool. And I mean, I like the idea of like, hey, you succeeded this thing. Here's the cool reward you get. If you escape from, a city while you were being pursued and whatnot, there's a ability that triggers there. If you save someone at sea. So that stuff's all really great. The trouble is the execution. Like there's no guidance on really, first off, there's no specific examples of how ship combat should function, which is a huge oversight. Because it just basically says, well, just run it how you want. There's also no mechanical difference between any different size of vessel. So in our game, we had someone piloting a schooner, which is, or not piloting, but I live in a landlocked province, so my lack of nautical knowledge, you'll have to forgive. But a schooner is a small ship. It's 2 masts, and it's a relatively small and fast thing. And then there are galleons, which are these massive, like 3-decked things that are replete with cannons. There's no mechanical difference between the two of them. So, I mean, I don't need the game to be, for a game that's supposed to be narratively driven, I don't need it to be, you know, a really tactical kind of game in terms of how you play out ship-to-ship combat. But I would like to see some kind of mechanical nod so that players understand, like, oh, this is why I don't use my schooner to go up against a galleon. Now, I think the response from the narrative approach might say, well, you roll the dice, you find what the results are, and then you narrate that otherwise. You could say that is because your ship was, you know, slipping around and whatever else, and then it's got one lucky shot on the galleon. That's fine, but it doesn't give you any sort of narrative. It doesn't give you any input on the before those dice are rolled as to how that specific feature of your ship is going to affect the result in the game. So what it feels like with all those, you know, having played the set or run the game once and talking to my players afterwards, what it feels like is that there's a really elaborate game system that's on here that doesn't have a lot of fleshing out, that hasn't had a lot of examples or subsystems fleshed out around which you're supposed to drape your story. So I just, as much as I really love the setting and I love the, you know, making characters is super fun. It's neat the way they differ the ships. Where this game really falls down for me is that the system is just, it's really intrusive. In the sense that you have to frame everything you want to do through that mechanic. And it's also just, I feel like there's missing an extra level of detail in some of the other systems. That it's cool, like your advantages can make some modifications to your dice pool, or let you re-roll dice, or, you know, do other mechanical things. I'm not sure why there's none of that other stuff in, or even suggestions for how to do that other stuff in the actual implementation of the dice rolls, or the implementation of these systems. Like, for instance, I had to kludge together a way of the player's ship escaping from this Castilian galleon. And so what I just said is that, well, if you get to 10 raises, if you spend 10 raises before, you know, so then you've escaped. But until then, they're going to, you know, be shooting at you and whatever else. And I gave some opportunities, and I guess what you're supposed to do with the game is, in each individual scene, you sort of pre-write what opportunities are there and what consequences are there for each scene, and then the players have to sort of deal with those throughout. But yeah, I guess a related problem I've got with the system is that this game really encourages the players to, you know, figure out a way to shoehorn their very best skill into a scene. Because if you're rolling with a suboptimal skill, you will only maybe roll 1 or 2 raises. And what that means is that you're only going to have 1 or 2 opportunities to act in a given round. Whereas if you roll with something that you're actually good with, you'll be rolling 5 to 6 raises, which means you're going to have a lot more opportunities to do things in a scene. So if we think about that in terms of you know, how much time at bat each player has, the player who chooses to optimize and pick the best thing they are, you know, the best thing that they're trained in or they're able to use, they get to spend a lot more time in the spotlight than the character who chooses to do something different. And the thing I don't like about that, and my players have said they don't like about that, is that it disincentivizes you to do something neat and off the cuff or outside your normal wheelhouse, I guess. I run the Fantasy Flight Star Wars game, and one of the adages we have in that game is that Leia can drive a speeder bike. And by that we mean that, you know, Leia didn't demonstrate any kind of knowledge of racing or swooping or anything like that throughout the films, but when she hops on that speeder bike in Return of the Jedi, she's awesome at it. I mean, not so awesome as she didn't avoid crashing, but, you know, still. So that's cool. And then that system, as does the Conan system, which I run a lot on this channel, they allow you to try things that you're not great at and still be able to be reasonably competent at that. So, and there are other mechanics in it, like your fortune points in Conan or light side points in Star Wars. That'll help you maybe boost the opportunity of doing well with that. You can use hero points in this system as well too, but it doesn't feel like they have as much of a meaningful contribution. You're only getting one extra dice, and if it's something you're not trained at, and God forbid an attribute you're not really good at, you're maybe rolling 2 dice anyway. So which on average you're going to get 1 raise. So, so that's another thing that's a bit of a strike against it. It's just, it feels like that what my players had said in our debrief of it is that they really felt that they kind of had to pick the best thing if they wanted to actually have some meaningful contribution to a scene, they needed to figure a way to sort of work in their very best thing, which I think cuts against the feel and the flavor they're trying to go for in this, which is crazy, super bigger than life swashbuckling heroes. So that's a system. Let's go back to some positives again. The way that they handle monster creation and villain creation in this is deceptively brilliant, I think. Now, when I first read it the first time in PDF, it just didn't click with me because villains have an arbitrary rank, which is what their dice pool is. Anything they try, they use that dice pool. And then you divide that rank between strength, which is like their physical ability to impose their power and whatnot on other people, and intrigue, which is sort of like their extensive network and the things they have moving behind the scenes, the thugs they've got working for them and so forth. An example of, to use a Conan example, Thulsa Doom is a villain with moderate strength, but a ton of intrigue. And he'd probably have a really high villainy rank as well. So he's got, whenever he does things, he's quite competent at them. He's just not super tough on a one-on-one basis, but he has tons of followers. You contrast that with some of his thugs who probably have all strength and no influence or no intrigue. I think it's actually called influence. I'm fucking that up. But anyway, so that's a thing. And then what you do is you add special traits to your villain, which gives them either other abilities to do or other aspects. And those can be things like you can give them player character abilities like duelist schools or sorcery or certain other advantages. Or you can, if you want to make something more monstrous, you can add different traits too, like chitinous skin, so that you can spend a danger point, which is the equivalent of the hero point, to have it do no damage to them, to the villains. You can have them be scary. You can have them be shapeshifting. You can have them have vicious claws. You can make undead. So the brute squad that you carve your way through, now they've raised from the dead. So that's really cool, and it's really easy to throw together brute squads and villain squads. We didn't, in the adventure that I ran for my players, I had planned out this whole like Dracula kind of pastiche that was they were going to go to the Sarmatian Commonwealth, and I was going to have these cool undead hounds that they were going to do, and I was going to do this cool chase scene. So it's really, I really like that. Now, as evidence of the fact that I don't think I'm alone in struggling with how this game is supposed to be played, I also have I've got their first couple supplements. I've also got their first supplement, which is Heroes and Villains, which gives you a bunch of sample heroes and villains to play in it. Again, it's a beautiful book, really great ideas in here, really great suggestions on how to incorporate both the villains or the heroes into your campaigns. But the evidence I speak of is that there's about 8 pages that are wasted in here that are strictly reiterating how villains are supposed to work mechanically, including like a 4-page example of how villains are supposed to play out in duels with other players. I went through that again after I had run the game to make sure I wasn't missing something. And, I still am not further, I don't feel like there's anything further to this game that I've missed, mechanically speaking. So that's really just that's the system. That's the way it's designed to work. So the final chapter of the 7th Core book, though, is that is a game mastery advice, and it's a great section. John Wick is no stranger to this hobby. I've loved almost all the games that I shouldn't say I don't know if I've loved all those games because I haven't owned all those games. I've really enjoyed huge chunks of every game that he's produced. So, and the advice he gives in there is really, really good for the most part. There's one of the things I should mention as well too, this is not a game for morally ambiguous characters. This is a game for capital H heroes. The game actually incorporates a corruption mechanic. So if you do unheroic things, or like you murder someone or something like that, you gain corruption. And when you get to a certain point in corruption, you just lose your character. Now, this isn't like in, say, Shadow of the Demon Lord, where you're being corrupted by a devil or a demon or something like that, or for Five Rings players like the Shadowlands Taint, where you're going to slowly be corrupted by the foul magics of the Shadowlands, and your character's going to transform into something evil. This is just, I don't like the way that you're playing your character, so here's a step towards me taking your toys away. And that kind of paternalistic approach to DMing is just, I don't know. It can be dealt with in a much better way of just saying from the outset, this is the kind of game I want to run, and this is the kind of game I want to play. To have that sort of stick approach to penalize characters for playing characters, because one of the most interesting things you can see in, this is my 2 cents, but one of the things I love seeing is when the heroes are pushed into a place where they may not, they may make mistakes. And that gives the characters an opportunity, if nothing else, if they don't fall altogether, it gives them an opportunity for redemption. And who doesn't love a redemption story? And really what it reads like is a way of penalizing players who want to play a game that is different from what the designer of the game wants you to play. And I get that you can obviously avoid its, rule 0, you can ignore whatever you don't like, but it's written in the rules, and that's, I don't know. I don't like that level of, it's not saying I'll take my toys and go home. It's saying I'm keeping my toys, you go home, because you're not playing this character anymore. So I just don't like that. That said, the rest of the stuff in the GM section is really great stuff. It gives you some really good ideas of what the setting can be used for, and what you can, what kind of themes and so forth you can bring in there. It's got some good advice for just DMs in general, if you're either just starting off, or an old hat who would like to have some some refreshers or pointers. So overall, I don't regret getting the game. I think that it is, I'm glad I supported the game. I still have Nations of Thea 2 on order, which I will pick up, and I'll pick up the Crescent Empire thing. Would I run the game again? No, not in 100 years. I think that there are so many other games out there that do a much better job of, I don't know. I guess let me maybe give some context to why I won't. I'm an old school gamer, so I've been playing since the early 80s, and the newer approach towards narrative games is something that I'm trying to get into. I really love Blades in the Dark a lot. It's a terrific game. Mask looks really interesting. I haven't had a chance to run it yet, but it looks really like a really great game. This seems to be in that sort of wheelhouse too. And the thing I don't like about some of these narrative games is I love that there's really complex game mechanics. Like for instance, in Blades in the Dark, there's tons of great little subsystems that are going on in that game that make for a really fun, good, interesting game mechanics. There's good tactical decisions you can make in the context of the game mechanics that also translate into really terrific story elements and things that are happening in the fiction of the world. And that's great. That's really, really cool. And it's tons of fun. And in that way, the intricate game structure that is supporting your session really adds to the story and plays along with it. This, I feel, is the opposite. It is a more, and maybe it's because it's not as fully fleshed out, or it requires the DM to do a huge amount of creation of subsystems for each individual scene. And maybe that's an over-exaggeration, but you certainly need to come up with ways to run a chase, or run an infiltration of a villain's lair. It feels like the game takes you out of the narrative so you can roll your dice, make your raises, and then you get to slowly get back into the narrative as you spend your raises. and there's every role-playing game to a degree has some sort of intrusion onto the narrative through its mechanics, but I just feel like this is far more intrusion than what I want to see in the game. I also don't feel that it really adds an awful lot. There's just not enough to the mechanics of the game to make for really, I think, interesting or meaningful tactical decisions either. And I get that, oh, it's a narrative game. It's not supposed to be super mechanical, and you know, there's not supposed to be a bunch of crunch in the game, but I just don't think that, I mean, that just seems to me like it's a crappy excuse for just that are underwritten game mechanics. So all due respect to Mr. Wick, of course, I mean, it's a really, reading it was really, really interesting. It made me very excited to give it a try. I just don't think it's the game for me. So in terms of whether this game would be for you, what I would suggest is, I don't know whether there's a quick start of the system. I don't think there is, but there are. I'll include a link below. There's a guy whose name escapes me right now who runs a series of really great one-shot 7C sessions that I found really helpful and got me excited about running the game. So I'll include a link to that, so at least you can see how the game works. I wouldn't necessarily use my session as an example of how, I don't think I got any mechanics wrong. That's not true. I did get one mechanic wrong in it, but because of the conclusion I drew from it, I don't think I'm giving the fairest shake for the game. So take a look at that. If you want a really interesting, like faux European 15th to 17th century setting, this is a great game for that. There's a ton of great evocative material in here. While I don't think I'll run 7C again, the game, I would happily repurpose, like, you know, Modiphius's Conan or maybe Savage Worlds or something like that to run this again. I understand there's a really great Ubiquity game that has kind of a Three Musketeers sort of feel to it as well, which I can't remember the name. It's something Diabolique. But anyway, that may be, if you're into the Ubiquity system, that may be a way of using the setting material in here to run your game otherwise. So yeah, so those are my thoughts. I guess if that's if you want it just for a narrative light game, unless you were really a hardcore 7C fan, or you really wanted to use the setting material for something else, I'm not sure that you could justify the cost of this. I think there are probably better games that would service a swashbuckling style game. If you really, really love game like Apocalypse World style games, but you want even less structure to it, and you want to really just have almost like a Fiasco, I guess, level of game complexity, this may work for you. You know, you may find that the narrative that and the stories that you'll drive will supersede the fact that there's really not a lot to the game mechanics. Or you may have someone who's really interested in creating all the different subsystems. So each encounter you have is just effectively like a mini game, which could be really, really cool. But if you're someone who's looking for something to pick up and play, in particular, if you don't have, if you're a new GM, I don't think I would recommend this game, because you're just gonna feel that DMing is too hard, and it won't be you, it will be the system working against you, I think. So anyway, yeah, so that's it. That's my verdict on 7C second edition. If you have any comments, or you want to correct me on anything in this, please do leave comments in the video or in the section below, and I'll be happy to respond to those. Otherwise, thanks so much for slogging through this somewhat muddled review and critique of the game, and I hope to see you again soon.